Hello,
Hoş geldiniz.
I am Dr. Işılay Gürsu.
Dr. Peter Cherry.
Welcome to the Heritage Turkey podcast by the British Institute at Ankara, BIAA.
And today we're very pleased to have with us Jim Crow. Now, Jim is Emeritus Professor of Roman and Byzantine Archaeology at the University of Edinburgh, but he's also Chair of the BIA. But his affiliation goes back a fair way. I think he first held a research fellowship here in 1978, which was then at the British Institute of Archaeology at Ankara. So welcome back to Ankara, Jim.
Thank you.
How has the city changed?
How's the city changed? How's Turkey changed? It was very clear on the bus last night coming from Izmit. What used to be a quite difficult drive from Ankara to Istanbul is now a sort of a huge motorway the whole way with cross sections, and the city reflects that as well in both its size and the buildings that one passes through. There's a sort of coming in quite late at night. There's a sort of almost a Las Vegas effect of all the coloured signs. So it's a very modern city, and it's changed pretty significantly. I think in terms of population, it's probably trebled or quadrupled since I first came here. I first came here actually over 50 years ago as a student in 1972, and then had a travel scholarship in 74, and then came back for a longer period of time in the late 70s.
Although we're in Ankara right now and you're professionally affiliated with Ankara, we can say, but most of your research focuses on Istanbul and especially on water structures of Istanbul. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
It has done for the last, I guess, 30 years. Before that, ever since I was an undergraduate, I was always introduced to the Karadeniz part of Turkey. It was the Black Sea region. This is because the professor I studied with as an undergraduate was a man called Anthony Breyer, who was always interested in the area around Trabzon in the Byzantine period in particular. And that's the area I first travelled in, and I did extensive travels on my own, some of it, in the very early 70s as a student. And I went back there. We had projects around Trabzon and then Mazara, and then subsequently I've written about all those places, and I've also written about Sinop. So I have a very strong, I have a good knowledge of the Black Sea region, and I have a real attachment. And I often feel that Istanbul belongs as much part to that Black Sea region. It's not really part of, Aegean Turkey. It's not part of southern Turkey, and it's not part of eastern Turkey or Anatolia. So I feel, moving westwards towards Istanbul was a sort of logical progression. Even, of course, it is the great city of the period that I'm most interested in.
Yes.
And your research spans Roman and Byzantine periods. So can you speak a little bit about the shift between those two periods?
I think I was always really interested in the medieval, but for a variety of reasons, I became more interested in the Roman, particularly in Eastern Turkey, with David French working on Roman frontiers. And then when I went back to Britain, I then excavated Hadrian's Wall. So I sort of developed an interest in Roman frontiers and Roman archaeology, and I had a familiarity with Roman archaeology. It's actually a lot easier to engage with it, really, than Byzantine archaeology. And I was just fortunate that as my career progressed, which, like many academic careers, wasn't quite straightforward, I managed to get a position where I could then teach Byzantine archaeology. So I did both. So that's why I do both. But I think primarily, I'm interested in the late Roman and the transition from antiquity into the medieval world, and that's what really concerns me. And more interestingly, most recently, I've been interested in, again, that transition from, certainly in terms of Constantinople, the transition from Constantinople to the Ottoman city Constantinople in the 15th century. So that sort of thing.
And specifically looking at water and environment issues.
Yeah, initially, as I said, I used to just do walls. I was pretty dull. Although I think walls actually do reflect human ambitions, human anxieties, and lots of other things. But for many people, Byzantine is certainly, in terms of buildings, that they immediately turn to churches, and I sort of stepped back from that. But so what happened was as an undergraduate, I'd had the opportunity very briefly to look at what was called the Anastasian Wall, which was a wall which goes from the Black Sea down to the Sea of Marmara, which is a remarkable linear boundary. So we managed to get a permit. I was delighted. Once I had an academic position, I thought, let's do something proper. Got a permit, got a little bit of funding. So we started work, and that's 60 kilometers west of Istanbul. So we started working there 30 years ago. But in the same vicinity, we suddenly saw these enormous aqueducts. And I'm afraid the aqueducts caught my eye. And once you've seen Kurşunlu in the middle of a forest, there's sort of like no turning back, because it is one of the great, remarkable, still very much neglected monuments of late antiquity. You put Hagia Sophia is on the one hand, and obviously some of the great buildings that you can see in Istanbul. But as a reflection of the power of the late antique Roman state, these great aqueduct bridges are spectacular.
Talking about really spectacular buildings, can I ask a specific question of one of them, which is the Yerebatan Sarnıcı underground system, because I think that's one of the first monuments that come to my mind when we are talking about water structures.
Absolutely. It's a remarkable structure. It's the biggest covered cistern ever constructed in the Roman world. It's much bigger. They always say there's something near, not far from Naples. It's nothing compared to the Yerebatan Saray. And, many other of the covered cisterns. And the Yerebatan Saray is almost like the end of a tradition which emerges in the later 4th century and into the 5th century of these large covered cisterns within the new city of Constantinople. And the Yerebatan Saray is the biggest. We're still not clear why such large cisterns were constructed, because when you have, let's say it was built in the 530s, 540s. By that stage, Constantine city, which was founded 1,700 years ago, virtually today, or a couple of days ago, as that city emerged, it became very built over. So it's not easy to construct so you have to construct such spaces within a populated city with some difficulty. So they actually constructed it within a square in front of a basilica. So basically that cistern represents a huge open space above. But within it is in itself a remarkable experience. And it's been appreciated as such since the middle of the 16th century, when the first Western description by Pierre Gilles, he's cheating a bit, and he says, I've discovered this. And then he tells us that all the locals knew about it. Well, yeah, but I've discovered it, he says. No, you haven't. It was known about, but you're the person who got there with the news first. Anyway, he has this wonderfully evocative description about it. And ever since then, people visiting Istanbul have been fascinated by the scale of it. It appeared in the James Bond film From Russia with Love, and so on. And of course, recently, the Istanbul Büyükşehir Belediye have done a fantastic job of renovation, absolutely spectacular. And so, I've just been to a conference in Istanbul, and various people said, I've just been to the new Yerebatan, the way it's been displayed, and it's so exciting to see it like that, and it is, and you can really appreciate it. Mind you, the queues are huge. It's very popular.
I am so glad that you mentioned about this. I discovered it, but while the information was there within the local communities for so long, that's something that I think we experience in all of the archaeological sites when they are being reported.
Mm. I mean, the queues are huge, but I also have to say I quite enjoy the artwork there.
Yeah, no.
It really adds something to it, I think, particularly with the use of light and stuff like that. It's a fantastic space.
No, I think that the İBB, the team who've been working on that monument and several others are doing a spectacular job at displaying the full heritage of the city, from the Roman to the Byzantine through to the Ottoman. And no, I think it's something really to be commended, and it's and in fact there's a new exhibition from a British excavation in the 1960s at Saraçhane of the Church of St. Polyeuctus, and now there are plans to create an exhibition which will, because they're doing work revealing the old excavation And I believe they're planning to do an exhibition associated with those British excavations.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah. Really interesting. So aside then from the Yerebatan Sarnıcı, are there other Roman and Byzantine water structures that we can find in Istanbul or any you recommend within Turkey?
Well, the obvious one, as far, but let's remember, I mean, there are lots of Roman aqueducts in Turkey, some of them very impressive, Aspendos and so forth. But from my perspective, I'm interested in this maintenance of that Roman tradition into late antiquity and the way that in Constantinople it's sustained and it's reworked in periods which we normally think are periods of abandonment and decline. But in terms of what's in the city, well, the obviously is the Buzdoğan Kemeri, which is often called the Aqueduct of Valens. It's this great bridge between, you have the Süleymaniye to the east and then crossing further to the west. And, you know, I know it's a bit of a nightmare for traffic planners, but at the same time, it's a spectacular bridge. And it's worth remembering that it was probably built in the 4th century and it remained in use well into the 20th century. Because there are Ottoman pipes which were used to bring water across the bridge into the 20th century. So that's pretty good legacy of Roman into Ottoman, and there's a continuity of these traditions.
Talking about these impressive monuments and structures, and some of them are really monumental. Can I ask who built these structures? Was it exploitative slavery? What about the workforce? Who designed them?
We know virtually nothing about that. Absolutely not. It's remarkable how, and this is not simply true for the late Roman and the Byzantine periods, this is true for the Roman periods. We have very little evidence outside of Rome itself for Roman aqueducts. Roman aqueducts, something like the Pont du Gard in the south of France, is a colossal structure and which we have no documentation virtually at all. So it's really for the architectural historian, for the archaeologist, to sort of understand the scale of works, the amount of stones needed, the distance the stones have to be carried, and then potentially sort of recreate the labor forces. But we don't know what the labor forces were, how far they were exploitative. I mean, it's like these old views of the Israelites building the pyramids, which is of course nonsense. I'm pretty sure it wasn't slave labor. I mean, one of the ways that an ancient city functioned, like most early modern cities, is by sort of day laboring, and this is true of actually many cities still today in the south, but sort of day laborers, and so they will have brought workers in, and it will have drawn workers in, presumably. So it will have come from the local population and surrounding peoples. Interestingly enough, almost the first record of the aqueducts in Thrace was by a Bulgarian, which was during the First Balkan War, when the Bulgarian army was besieging Constantinople up to the Çatalca lines. And so there's a detailed description, and this man, he wrote 2 descriptions actually. One was of the aqueducts themselves, and the second one, he talked to the villagers who lived in the vicinity of Çatalca. And at the time, many of the people were Greek-speaking Christians. The Muslims are Greek-speaking Christians. The Bulgarians probably had left by that stage, but there were stories which he recorded, and some of the villagers themselves tell stories about the pain that the workers must have felt in creating these works. It's very interesting, and these are not traditional. These are stories which have emerged not from a real tradition, but just sort of interesting people looking at these monuments and thinking how they themselves, as poor people who are oppressed, how they're likely people in the past will also have been oppressed. It's very interesting, these stories, and they do survive in this Bulgarian article that is fairly obscure and nobody's actually very much read. But it's an interesting reflection on how ordinary people relate to monuments, how ordinary people in the relatively recent past relate to monuments.
Yeah, amazing.
So you've also worked on late Roman hydraulic engineering. What is it that's so special about this technology?
I think that's something I came into having looked at the monuments, and then we were very fortunate. We were working with an Italian hydrogeologist who was my collaborator. Alessandro Ricci had connections with the University of Rome, and he taught me a lot about water and how water works, and just by going around the aqueduct channels, not so much the bridges, but remember, the bridges are only part of a much more complicated system which allows the water to be drawn by gravity over huge distances, and these really are enormous distances, sort of over 300 kilometers. So working so that taught me to begin, and then when I went to Edinburgh, I then encountered some civil engineers again who were interested in water engineering, and so we had a project working with them, which I think was really quite produced some quite interesting results of trying to combine the historical, the archaeological, and the engineering approach to get a better understanding of how the complexities of the system, and essentially, ultimately, when I fully explain the system to engineers, contemporary engineers, they say, "How on earth did they achieve this?" Because it's just such an enormous. I mean, it's the longest Roman water supply line ever built.
A great continuation, I would say, of traditions. Do you see that kind of continuation from Byzantine periods to Ottoman period?
Absolutely, there's no question. I mean, it's apparent in the autobiography of Sinan, because Sinan, I mean, amongst all the he talks about, he does actually talk about the reconstitution of the aqueducts for the new city of Istanbul, particularly the Kırkçeşme system, much of which comes from the Belgrade Ormanı, the forest of Belgrade. So he talks there about finding the channels of the infidel. So he's actually describing he realizes that there are earlier aqueduct channels. And also the same writer, Pierre Gilles, who describes the Yerebatan Saray, he also describes the area around Istanbul, not just a description of the city. And he also talks about in the area of Belgrade, the village of Belgrade, how there are these old pipes and arches of the Greeks, he calls them. So there is a real legacy. It's difficult to track the legacy, and in fact many of the monuments in the immediate vicinity, which is now part of the great sprawl of Istanbul to the west, have been destroyed in the expansion of the city. But it's surprising that there are still some traces surviving. Yeah.
So the recent project that you have led with the BIA, Water in Istanbul Rising to the Challenge, it was also tackling these kinds of questions.
That was looking specifically, trying to look at the area of the Topkapı Saray, because there, remarkably, within the walls of the Saray, is some of the best preserved Byzantine monuments in Istanbul, because things have not changed in the palace in the way that they have outside of the palace. And so there are, I don't know, maybe there are more cisterns, groups of cisterns proportionately than anywhere else in the city. And it's also quite clear that many of those systems have been continued to be used, possibly not used in the same way they were used in Byzantine times, but certainly used for water storage in order to provide water for the gardens, provide water for, water as a source in case of a fire, all sorts of, there are sources which do, and we haven't looked at all of them, but there are sources which tell us, it's Turkish sources. So it is quite surprising how there is this continuity continuity is always difficult. Continuity is to be precise, it's not as if they handed over, but there's certainly reuse, recycling, repurposing of previous Byzantine structures for similar purposes. Yeah.
And moving from the Ottoman to the contemporary then, so water shortage is obviously a key topic now as well. So what insights do you think that your research on historical water management has for the present day?
It's always I think it's always tricky. People say learning lessons from the past. It's never. It's not a linear.
Yeah.
They did it this way. We can do it that. It's gaining insights into experiences of the past, which I think can be important. And one of the lessons that we learned from that project was explaining to the contemporary water engineers. This was my colleagues from Istanbul Technical University and me. We gave them a number of presentations about the extent of the old water systems, particularly the Byzantine water systems, the numbers of cisterns in the city. It made them think perhaps more carefully about issues relating to water storage, recycling water, making sure that collecting rainwater harvesting, issues like this. And so I think so I don't think they said, oh, we can do it the Byzantine way. But what they did was they recognized that for a large city to survive in the past, these hybrid measures of water, bringing water in, but also of storing water, were significant. And they could perhaps have, that they needed to change their own approaches in light of these experiences. And so I think the way that project has developed, I won't say how much what we said to them was significant, but it made people think. And it was interesting how, in some ways, they were quite excited by learning about aspects of the water history in the city, which they were unfamiliar with.
Wonderful. Do we know any protests from late Roman or Byzantine periods that involved water issues?
Protests, the main protests are concerned with drought. So we do know, of course, that, Procopius, who was writing in the 6th century, at the time of the great Emperor Justinian, who built Hagia Sophia, he records periods of drought. And in some of his writings, he's very critical of the emperor. Others, he's very pro-emperor, but in some of his writings he's very critical, and in the ones where he's critical, he likes to highlight, the emperor hadn't done any work on the aqueducts, and there was no water, and the population were causing, and this is a continuing problem throughout all periods, I suspect, and certainly into the Ottoman period. There are times when it's difficult to control water, and huge cities are. They're always on a knife edge, because you've got to be able to bring in food resources, you've got to bring in water resources, because you have a population who can't just go into their back garden or the stream down the road to get what needs for the basic commodities of life. So they need something, to be transmitted into the city. And if the state or whatever management applies, if it's not succeeding in that, then it will cause disruption, civil dissent. So there's several instances of that.
Thank you. Can I ask a general question about the state of Byzantine studies right now, like comparing it to the studies in Turkey and the UK, for instance?
I've just come back from, as I mentioned, I've just come from a conference in Istanbul, which was celebrating the 1700th foundation of the city by Constantine the Great, which was a 2-day conference with a number of speakers from outside of Turkey, but many speakers from principally from Istanbul. It was very well attended. It wasn't very well advertised. People are saying, we didn't hear about it. It wasn't very well advertised, or it wasn't especially well advertised, should I say. But at the same time, there were many people who were simply interested public there, and they were interested, they asked some interesting, pertinent, relevant questions. And I think Byzantine studies has really developed over the last 20 years, perhaps a bit longer, but particularly the last 2 decades. And there are the numbers of students and numbers of universities where particularly Byzantine art and archaeology are taught, and some universities with their real strengths in Byzantine history. So, I think Byzantine studies, I think there's a much greater awareness academically of the Byzantine past and its significance for contemporary Turkey. Yeah. So I think it's a pretty positive journey that's been carried over the last 2 decades. it's always Byzantine studies as such is always it always is in let's say in England and Britain, it's it continues. It doesn't. I wouldn't say it's flourishing, but there are a number of centres, and my university in Edinburgh, we've run a course on Constantinople from its foundation to 1453 for the last, I think, 7 or 8 years, and we always have lots. We have full. This is a special subject, full undergraduates, and we normally have about 20 graduate students, so it's always popular. So I think if you put the right course on, it will get the attention that it deserves, and so that people are interested in this. I mean, you have to remember, Byzantium for the West it's neither one nor the other. It doesn't fit easily. It's sort of orientalized with a small o.
Mm-hmm.
It's and very often, the Byzantines, but they were actually a much greater power as far as most of Eastern Europe was concerned than anywhere else. Anyway, so there is this tendency that it's sort of somewhat set aside in terms of the way that Western medieval studies have developed.
And as a last question, but also speaking more broadly and speaking to your position as chair of the BIA, what are your views on academic research on Turkey more broadly in the UK? And what do you see as the BIA's kind of role in developing Turkish studies more generally?
I think it's very important that in Britain, it's difficult to say whether I think that this has improved over the last few years. I think Turkish studies are not central. I think Islamic, for obvious reasons, the Islamic world has suddenly become very important, but it's essentially an Arab Islamic world that's considered to be important. The significance of Turkey, and particularly of Turkish history and Ottoman history, I think remains neglected in sort of British history departments, and I think that's and the real dilemma that arises from that is that it means that we don't really focus on the breadth of the Ottoman world, the fact that the Ottomans were part of Eastern Europe, Southeastern Europe, for such a long period of time. The fact that the Ottomans, I mean, I just noticed actually last week in Edinburgh there was a talk about, there were some lectures precisely about this, that it was the right sort of thing, and it was to do with the Ottomans in the Near East.
Yes.
But all too often that Ottoman dimension is neglected. And I remember hearing about the problems that research students have working on areas like Palestine in the 18th and 19th century if they cannot deal with the Ottoman sources. Syria and Palestine, if you only read Arabic and you don't read Osmologia, you're actually denying yourself the ruling sources. How can you actually deal with it? So I think it's important academically, and I think it's important in a wider that we remain aware of the significance of that Ottoman past and its significance for contemporary Turkey, because only then can we begin to understand contemporary Turkey. And of course, there are specialists in Turkey who do, but that wider, you often feel that Turkey is sometimes neglected. Why is Turkey interested in this? Why should we do that? I know it's a nation state now, but it wasn't a nation state. It's only since 1920, whatever, 24. So I think that past needs to have a higher dimension.
And I think also just the crucial status of Turkey generally within the region, within the area. I mean, I was talking to someone recently who was saying it's hard to think of any political issue, even involving Africa or Latin America, where Turkey is not playing some kind of role.
Yes.
And has become increasingly important for the UK as we've left the European Union. So, I mean, that's my thing, is that I think UK universities should pay a lot more attention to Turkey than they do.
Yes, contemporary Turkey is another dimension, but I'm less familiar with contemporary history and political studies, but I certainly agree. And it has and I think the way that the reach, Turkey has a reach, which is of course almost like reflected in your first question. It was how does Ankara look? And it looks like a vibrant, very powerful city, and also quite a tidy city. This was somebody when we were in Istanbul. Obviously, we're in Eminönü. It wasn't in the deep suburbs or something, but it was a very tidy city. Certainly it's well maintained, which is always, in some senses, a good reflection of the current state of the nation, whatever other problems there might be.
Well, that's probably a good way to end it. Well maintained.
Well maintained, yes. Thank you so much, Jim. It was an honor and privilege to have you here at our podcast.
Well, no, I'm very happy to be here.
Thanks very much. And, well, görüşürüz.
Görüşürüz.